It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Puris coming to you from Baltimore. President Trump presented a $200 billion infrastructure plan on Monday. The basic plan is to use the $200 billion to provide incentives to state and local governments as well as private sector investors to provide $1.3 to $1.5 trillion in infrastructure investment over the next 10 years. Joining me now to analyze Trump's infrastructure plan is Rob Johnson. Rob is president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking and a senior fellow and director of the Global Finance Project for the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute in New York. It's been a while, Rob. Good to have you back.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start off with your first reaction to this plan.
My first reaction to the plan is that it's a fantasy. To go with $200 billion and expect to get about something close to 6-to-1 leverage from private sector participation is shocking, unless the $200 billion is used to protect the downside so that the private sector receives one-sided bets. I'm also very concerned about the role of money in lobbying in politics, the problems associated with concentrated power. I think the difficulty in making good decisions for people in the United States affects all of our politics, but this plan will probably be what you might call a victim of that misaligned set of incentives.
Right. And then a major part of this is to put up public funds, incentives for corporations to invest in our infrastructure, and even wholesale privatization of our infrastructure. What are the consequences or implications of this type of infrastructure planning?
Well, the metaphor that's used, what you might call validates or promotes the private sector, is what economists call perfect competition. And the danger with monopolies is that the privatization of things like water and roads and other things allows a monopolist to charge very substantial prices above what it costs to provide the service. And they're not regulated. And through the money politics, they deter regulation or enforcement of that regulation. And it does not serve the public very well. I don't necessarily believe in the mythology that the private sector always does things more efficiently than the public sector. I worked for a while with one of the major motor companies in the United States, and subsequently I worked on the staff of the Senate Banking Committee with William Proxmire and on the Senate Budget Committee with Pete Domenici. Both of those staffs were much more efficient than my department at General Motors. So I think the mythology that when you privatize, things are going to be more efficient is probably a little bit too optimistic. And I think that the problem of lobbying and campaign contributions regarding the enforcement of regulation, the provision of service, what price you can charge and whether that's a fair price, this is not a competitive market with regard to most of these infrastructure developments. These are natural monopolies.
Right. Now, give us some real-life examples of this kind of policies that has led to disasters that have confronted us over the last few years, even before Trump.
Well, you've seen problems in parking meters in Chicago or roads and toll roads. Some have been done well. In parts of Spain, I understand things were very well done and well maintained, but in the United States, some of the toll roads have been extremely expensive, not well kept up. We've had privatization of the train tracks that underpin Amtrak, and we also apparently had, according to David K. Johnston, a very unsavory limited liability. People who own the tracks didn't have to pay the lawsuits on accidents if the accident was caused by disrepair of the tracks, which gave them no incentive to repair the tracks. They were very good at lobbying and passing off the risk onto the taxpayer, And as a result, we've had more accidents on Amtrak, according to David.
Rob, this infrastructure plan was, of course, presented to us along with what we saw a few weeks ago, Trump's tax plan, which gives huge incentives and cuts to the private sector. With the two combined, and then, of course, the budget that was also presented yesterday for 2019, what are the consequences of all of these plans coming together?
Well, I would say that where the Trump administration is clever is that they seem to have a very clear-minded sense of the structure of American politics and its incentives. To put it another way, the infrastructure plan and the tax cuts are very beneficial to donors. And donors and the large money that they provide has historically been important in elections. So I know my colleague Tom Ferguson talked about the marvel of and the innovation of the Bernie Sanders campaign and what that might portend for the future with broader-based, small-scale fundraising. But the Trump plan is asking big business, big media, etc., finance, to get on their side and understand that they are all about promoting them. What we might ask, as Benjamin Page and Martin Gillens have asked in some of their writings, is whether this represents the other 90% of the population. There's an awful lot of evidence that it doesn't, including, in my opinion, the election of Donald Trump, based on what you might call the disease of despair. The structure of American politics right now, particularly reliant on money and concentrated interests, concentrated wealth, concentrated corporate power, is not aligned with the public good. So it's likely that the tax code changes and the infrastructure plan both contribute to what I call a gift to the donors, which will inspire them to support financially and through the media and other dimensions the current administration. Those who believe that this is a good plan believe that the economy has been stagnant for a long time and it needs a pickup, and the only way you're going to get that is through supporting business. But there is a price associated with giving monopoly power to private entities and in our current political economic system.
Now, Rob, yourself and many other progressive and liberal economists we have on The Real News often say this kind of spending, stimulating the economy, investing in infrastructure are all good things. However, we know that there's a big deficit attached to this kind of spending as well. Would you stick to that argument now as someone who's advocated for spending and deficit spending in the past?
Our recent history has been one of deficient aggregate demand, and that's led to slackness in the labor market, downward pressure on wages, and so forth. So in the macroeconomic sense, something that stimulates aggregate demand can contribute to the good, and some of these policies, not so much the privatization, but the tax plan probably qualifies. The question that you can ask is that the best and most stimulative tax plan we could have had? And is the distribution of the benefits going to the already powerful and already wealthy, or is it going to the people who have been suffering? I think the tax plan, as it sits, will have a positive impact, but I don't think it's as positive an impact as we could have had if it was more designed with progressive and public goods in mind.
Finally, what effect will this requirement for states and cities to contribute their lion's share of investment for infrastructure have in terms of geographic inequality in the U.S.? In other words, will larger cities and states, I guess richer states, have greater capacity to do that compared to ones that are not so rich, like Detroit, as an example?
Oh, I would say it will exacerbate that inequality. Wealthy places like New York and San Francisco can afford services, and because you're talking about public-private partnerships, the private sector entities are going to be more enthusiastic about providing these services in affluent areas where people can afford to pay them more. On the other hand, though, and you kind of have a yin and yang here, wealthy people sometimes don't like to pay taxes. And they understand, because they earn a disproportionate amount of the income and the wealth, that they don't want the infrastructure. They don't need it. They live in gated communities, have private transportation, private communications, and so forth. So they won't, or public schools, they don't rely on as much as private schools. So you get to a place where these people say, we don't want to spend on that, and they use their financial power to influence politicians to vote it down. But I don't know which will prevail in different places, but an infrastructure plan that isn't uniform across the nation and meeting the needs of a vast majority of people is probably going to exacerbate the inequality.
All right, Rob, as always, very good to have you on the Real News Network, and looking forward to having you back very soon.
Thanks very much. And I would say, remain hopeful.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.